Hello everyone, this is Professor Robert Solis and welcome to our next video lesson. We're going to be talking about Lab 29, which is the creation of a letter pyramid. So let's go ahead and create the graphical user interface and then we can continue from here. So I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio. We'll create a Visual Basic Form. We're going to call this project CS111 Lab 29 Project. And then click OK. Okay, so here's our form, and I'll be switching back and forth here to see what the graphical user interface is supposed to look like, but looks like we're going to have to drag and drop a label, a text box, and a button. So let's do that first. Okay, so we'll need a label, a text box, and a button. Let me take the label, drag it, and drop it to the upper left-hand corner. And it looks like that label is supposed to say enter a letter in terms of the text property. So let's go over here to the text property, change this to enter a letter. And then there's a text box right next to it. Okay, so let's switch back over here. Put the text box next to it like this. Maybe reduce the size just a little bit. I know the form is going to have to increase in size here, so let me go ahead and do that now. And looks like we have a button right next to that text box, so something like this. And we'll increase the size all the way to here. Say, for example, this thing over here on the bottom is a label. So I'll just take this label, Control-C, Control-V, so I can make a copy and paste of this one. Change the auto size property to false. We'll change the border style to fixed 3D. And let's go ahead and change the size so it fills up the majority of the screen. Say, for example, something like that. Let's get rid of the text, and also let's center that, because you'll notice that the text is going to be centered along the top side of the label. So in terms of the alignment, we'll change this to top center. There's the text right there. In fact, we don't need that text now. So let me double click over here on the text property, press delete, get rid of that. Let's change that button text property to create pyramid. So text property, create pyramid, enter. And the form caption, let's see what that's supposed to say. So letter pyramid, okay. So let me click the form, letter pyramid, enter. And I've also, like, I didn't remove the minimize and maximize box, so it looks like everything's okay. At this point I can go ahead and create the various names for the different controls on the screen. So it looks like we're going to have the button as btn submit. So let's change that name property to btn submit. The label is supposed to be LBL result. And the text box is txt user input. All right. So I think that's pretty much it in terms of the graphical user interface. Now let's describe what it is that the user is going to be doing. The user is going to enter a letter, any letter from A to Z. And then when the user clicks the Create Pyramid button, a pyramid of letters is supposed to be formed. So in this case, you'll see that the letter H was entered, and then we always start off with the letter A, and then we work our way to ABA, and then ABCBA, all the way up to ABCDEFGH, because that's what the user letter is, and then we work our way down from H all the way back to A. So as you can see here, it forms a triangle of letters. One of the things that we're doing is we're going to change the letter that was entered by the user from lowercase to uppercase if they entered a lowercase letter. Some observations to consider would be the first letter is always going to be A for the beginning of every single row. we work up from A to ABA to ABCBA, so I'm seeing an increase of letters from row 1. It goes from 1 letter, the next row includes 3 letters, and the next row includes 5 letters. So these are some of the different observations that you need to consider before you're actually going to begin your program. All right, so with this in mind, let's switch over to Visual Studio, and let's double-click the button and start programming. Well, the first thing that I'm going to do is put some comments here to indicate what it is that we're going to do. So the first thing that we're going to do is have a bunch of declarations, and then we're going to initialize some of those variables, and I'll explain what I mean by that when we get to that section. Now, one of the things that we have to consider is when the user is entering a second letter. So the first time, let's say that the user enters the letter H over here in the text box, clicks this, and so now we have a letter pyramid. But then all of a sudden they go back over here and enter a different letter, and then click Create Pyramid. Well, we want to be able to clear the previous display. Well, let's make a note of that to clear the label box of the previous content. All right, the next thing we have to consider is to convert the user entry to a capital letter. They may have entered a lowercase letter, so we have to consider that. Then we're going to have to determine the ASCII value, and that's the strategy that we're going to use. I'll talk about that when we get to this section. Change the ASCII value of the user entry. Then we're going to determine, how many rows of the pyramid to print, because we're going to have a while loop that will essentially keep on looping until we get to the maximum row as requested by the user. And then this section will be while there are rows to print. We're going to keep on doing this one section over and over again as long as there's rows to print. And then obviously that's going to be printing them to the output. So those are the different sections of our program. Well, let me start off with just a couple of declarations. First of all, I know that we're going to have to obtain the user's entry. So let's go ahead and declare user entry as a string. I know that I want to keep track of the output, so I'm going to go ahead and create an output variable that's going to keep track of, and it's going to constantly be appended to, so that it will have the latest and greatest information in terms of the letter pyramid. I also want to obtain the first letter, which is always going to be letter A. So I want to have a separate string for that. And my letter as string. We also want to declare the ASCII variable, or the ASCII value, I should say, of A. And so that's going to be an integer. We're also going to declare the ASCII value of the user's number. We'll have to determine that later. Then we're going to have to know which one of these ASCII values to print. So the strategy for this program is, instead of using letters to print, in terms of its analysis, we're going to first determine the ASCII value of the letter, and that's going to be a whole lot easier in terms of determining the next letter. So what we'll do is we'll create ASCII to print as integer, then rows to print, similarly columns to print, and then finally we're going to have a column counter to help us when we get to our looping section. In terms of the initialization, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to say first letter is going to be assigned to the letter A. And then I would like to know its ASCII value. Well, we have already created a variable for that, and that's going to be ASCII of A. And the way that I can determine the ASCII value is to use this function right here. Notice that the tooltip says that it returns the integer value representing the character code corresponding to a character. So we're literally changing the value of, or we're not changing rather, but we're retaining the value, the ASCII value of any given letter. So I put that in parentheses, and you can see here, according to the parameters, I'm supposed to put in a string S character. Well, in this case, that's going to be first letter. Next, I'll want to know which one of the ASCII values is going to be printed. So I'm going to put that in ASCII of print. And the first letter in this case is supposed to be ASCII of A. And then in terms of the counter, let's go ahead and just set column equal to 1. Next, let's go to the clear the label box of the previous content. So that's pretty easy. We're just simply going to set the label equal to nothing. So we'll set that equal to quote, quote, the text property, that is. Now let's convert the user's entry to a capital letter. Well, that's pretty easy. What we're simply going to do is user entry is going to equal to whatever the text box text is. So now that we've obtained that information, let's now make sure that it's in uppercase. And so to do that, we'll just simply say user entry dot to upper, open and close parentheses. So this will change, or this will verify that the user's entry has been converted to uppercase in case they didn't do that. Next, in terms of determining the ASCII value of the user entry, that's pretty easy. We're just simply going to say ASCII of user, which is this variable here, is going to be the ASCII value, that's the function of the user's entry value. So now we have the ASCII value. So if they entered the letter A here, the appropriate ASCII value of the letter A, capital letter A, say for example, is going to be assigned here. Now let's go ahead and determine how many rows, whoops, misspelling here, determine how many rows of the pyramid to print. Well, to do that, let's go ahead and say take rows to print is equal to ASCII value of the user minus ASCII value of A plus 1. And then columns to print is going to equal to column. Okay, so what's the story behind this particular statement? What is it that we are trying to do? Well, notice over here in this particular web page that lists the ASCII characters and all of the corresponding numbers that they're worth, their value. If the user were to enter the letter A, well, that's worth 65. And then if the user were to list the letter H, say for example, well, that's 72. Well, let's see here. I'm going to count with my fingers, and you do the same thing. So let's go from A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. That's 8 letters. Well, that means that we would need to display 8 rows, right? The first row would be A, the next row would be A, B, A, the next row would be A, B, C, B, A, so forth and so on. In fact, I have it right over here. That's a total of 8 rows if they enter H, right? Check this out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right. So we have 8 rows, but notice that if the user enters H, that's 72. A, that's 65. Well, 72 minus 65, that's 7. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to consider how we can make it so that this thing is equal to 8. So we'll just simply do this. Whatever the subtraction is, or whatever the difference is between the user's ASCII value and the ASCII value of the letter A, plus 1. So if this were H, and of course this is going to be A, so far we have 7 plus 1 more, that'll give us our 8. And then we'll know how many rows that we're going to need to print. And then in terms of the columns to print, well, I know the columns counter is equal to 1 at first, because, switch back over here, because in this case we're going to only have 1 column for our first row. For our next row, we'll have 3 columns, A, B, A. For our next row, we'll have A, B, C, B, A, which is 5 columns, so forth and so on. So we'll leave that counter as is. Okay, and now we can go over here to this next section where it says while there are rows to print. Well, the first thing I'll do is I'll establish the while statement that says rows to print. As long as that is greater than or equal to 1. All right, as long as this statement is true, then let's go ahead and print from the letter A to the user entry. Well, in this example, the user entered the letter H, so we would go from A to ABA, ABCBA, ABCD, CBA, so forth and so on, all the way to this last row. That's what this section is going to do. Well, the first thing that I want to have to consider is which ASCII value do I need to print? Well, what we'll do is we'll say ASCII to print is equal to ASCII of A. That's the first letter to print. As you can see on the first row, we're going to print the letter A. In fact, we'll always print the letter A first. So now that I have this, then I'll have another while statement, which indicates how many columns to print. So while there are columns to print, and that is, while columns to print is greater than or equal to 1, that's what this section is going to do. Well, if that is in fact greater than or equal to 1, then we'll do this. We'll say my letter is equal to, and now we have this function over here called the character function, and it returns the character associated with the specified character code, because you don't want to display ASCII numbers. You want to display the appropriate character of that particular ASCII value. So the way we're going to do that is to press the parentheses, and we'll say the ASCII value of, or the ASCII value to print. Well, if you'll recall over here, the ASCII value to print at first is going to be the letter A. So that's what we want to do. We have the ASCII value of A, which we know is, let's see here, ASCII value of A is 65. So this thing is worth 65 right here. Oops, no, not right there. Right here. This thing is worth 65. So ASCII value to print is 65. You don't want to display 65. You want the character that 65 represents, which in this case is going to be the letter A. Well, once you've done that, let's go ahead and append the output. So we'll just say output is equal to output, and we're going to concatenate that with my letter and that should do it, because as you can see here, my letter is a string. Whatever the output is, that's a string as well. We're going to append that. Now, at first, you see that we have this caution, this warning here that says that this very output is used before it has been assigned. Well, I guess what we could do is we could initialize that to get rid of the warning. We'll just simply set that equal to nothing. So I'll put a quote code over here on the declaration of the variable output. Go back over here to the bottom. That should take care of that green squiggly line. All right, well, once we've obtained the output, then we're going to do this ASCII character to print is equal to ASCII character to print plus 1. So what this is doing is we're preparing for the next column, and I don't know if I'm going to be printing another letter or not. That's going to be determined by the while statement. In this case, I know there's only one letter in the first column, or the first row rather. But again, we're preparing for that. We don't know that this loop is not supposed to continue on. It just depends on the value of columns to print. Well, once I have prepared for the next row or the next column, then I can also say columns to print is going to be decremented. So we'll say -1 here. So what we're doing is we're going to keep on printing to the output new columns until finally columns to print is no longer greater than or equal to 1. Well, now that we've done this, let's create another comment over here. We're going to print from the user entry to A. Let me describe what this section does. So in essence, what we're doing is we're dividing the columns into two different parts. For example, let's look at this last row. The first part of my program is going to print from A to H. The next part of my program is going to print from G back to A. So H is the user entry. And that's what I'm saying over here. Let's go ahead. The first part is to print from A to H, the user entry. The next part is to print from H to A. So now that we've established the first part of the row, which is to draw up to the user entry, now we're going to do the same thing from the user entry back down to A. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll say columns to print is equal to column minus 1. And so what this will do is, whatever the column count is, we're going to subtract 1 from that to determine the columns to print. You may be asking, how did I determine that? Well, notice this. For this last row, for example, we know that from letter A to letter H, that's going to be 8. So how many left if I were to draw the remaining part of that row? Or I keep on saying draw. If I were to print the remaining part of the row. Well, that's G, F, E, D, C, B, A. That's 7 letters. So I'm noticing that the first 8 letters will get me up to the user entry. And then if I take that number 8, subtract 1 from it, that tells me the remaining amount of letters to get back to the letter A. So that's an observation that I make so that I can set columns to print equal to 1 less than whatever the column counter is. Well, now that I've established that, let's go ahead and say ASCII value to print is equal to ASCII value to print minus 2. All right, some of you may be wondering why it is that I am increasing ASCII to print, or decreasing rather, ASCII to print by 2. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold off on that question by running the code later on, and we'll stop right over here so that I can explain this. I think once you see the code as it runs, it'll be an easier thing for me to explain how this line of code works. Okay, so we're ready for the while statement. So over here we'll say while columns to print is greater than or equal to 1, and my letter is going to be the character value of whatever ASCII to print is. The output then is going to be concatenated with the value of my letter. And then we have to get ready for the next ASCII character to print. So I decrement that by 1 because right now we're on the descending part of displaying the appropriate rows. So in other words, what I mean by that is we've already displayed A, B, C, D, say for example. So now we're on the descending side. So the next letter would be C, B, A, say for example. So that's what this does. It gets we're going to print the next letter below, or the next descending letter. Okay, and then in terms of columns to print, well, we need to decrease that because we've already printed 1 column. So let's indicate that we need 1 less now. And that takes care of that while statement. Well, once we've done all of this, outside of this while statement, we can now take the output and we need to concatenate a VB new line. So what this does is it says, once we've displayed the letters, so for example, let's say in this given row that we've just displayed A, B, C, D, C, B, A. All right, I need to go to the next row, and so I can continue typing or to continue to print whatever letters are going to be on this given row. Well, in order to do that, you need to move from here to here, the beginning of the next line, and that's what this VB new line constant does. It moves the cursor to the beginning of the next line. All right, so let me get rid of this. And now, get ready for the rows to print. Rows to print. And we're going to decrease that by 1, or we're going to decrement it. And the reason why is because you've already printed 1 row, so that means we got to decrease it to get ready for the remaining rows that need to be printed. So that's going to be decreased by 1. And then in terms of the columns, we're going to say column is equal to column plus 1. And again, this is one of those lines that may not necessarily seem intuitive. It seems like column should increase by 2 since we go from A to ABA, that's an increase of 2 letters. ABCBA, that's an increase of 2 letters. It seems like we should increase this by 2, but let me stop the code here and I'll explain later why it is that I'm only increasing it one time. Or increasing it by 1, I should say. And then in terms of columns to print, we're going to assign that to column, or assign a column to print, I should say. Once we're finished with the while loop, then we simply output the results. So we can say send output results to the label, and that'll just simply be lbl result.text is equal to whatever the output string is. Okay, let's run the code and specifically look at these two sections to see what happens. So I'm going to run the program, and I'll enter the letter C here. So that means I expect to see A, ABA, ABCBA. So I'll click Create, Pyramid, and let's go back to the code, and it stops the program right here. So you'll notice that ASCII to print is equal to 66, and just so that I can go back to the web page here, you'll see that 66, that's the letter B, right? Because in other words, we've already displayed the letter A, and you can see this in the autos panel. On the output, A already exists. By the way, if you don't see autos, let's pretend that you don't. If you don't see the autos panel, just simply click Debug, Windows, and then you can click on autos, and that'll display automatically those variables that are active as of our current point in the program. So right now we have on the output, we have the letter A. And what we're going to do now is we're going to get ready to print the next row. So it's going to decrease it by 2. So let's see what happens here. So I decrease it by 2. That goes to 64. Okay, while columns to print, which it's 0 right now, so there are no more columns to print. In other words, that first row just has one column. That's why when columns to print was decremented up here in this while loop, over here for the second while loop, it doesn't have anything to print because it's just the first row, right? So we'd only have the letter A. So this is going to be false. Go through that. So the output now is going to be sent the VB new line constant. So we're going to go to the next line. Now notice how this manifests over here in the output section. So when I click the step over, it looks like there's a space right here, but really what that is it's an invisible VBCRLF control or carriage return line feed. That's really what VB new line is. So even though it looks like a space, there's really the cursor is blinking at the beginning of the next line. Okay, we've just printed one row, so now let's indicate that by decrementing the total number of rows left to print. Well, in this case, since we've just printed, since rows to print is 3, we're about to decrement it, so now that becomes 2. Columns, we're going to increase this by 1. And this is the section of the code where I said, let's see what happens when I do this. So let's go ahead and increment this. So columns now is equal to 2. It was 1. So therefore, columns to print is going to be equal to 2. And there it is. And so now we can go back to the top of the while statement. And rows to print, how many more rows do we have left to print? Well, we have 2 more rows to print. So let's go ahead and enter this while loop. And in terms of the ASCII value to print, we want to display the ASCII value of A. Columns to print is equal to 2. Is 2 greater than or equal to 1? Yes, it is. So we're going to go inside here. The ASCII value to print is the number 65, which is the letter A. So my letter is about to be equal to A. And here it is. It's equal to the letter A. Let's take the output and let's concatenate that with the current letter. So now, as you can see from the output, it's equal to A. And recall, this is really going to the beginning of the next line. So we have the A of the next row. Well, once we have that, so I can go ahead and get ready for the next ASCII value to print. So I increase that by 1. Now, in terms of the number of columns left to print, there's only 2 more, right? Because for the next row, we want ABA. So that's why it says we have to decrease this by 1. So now we have 1 more row to print. 1 more column, I should say, to print. Go back to the top of the while loop. Columns to print is equal to 1. Is 1 greater than or equal to 1? Yes, it is. So now the letter to display is the letter B. Right? So we want to see A and then ABA, so that's why this is the letter B. So let's send that to the output variable. And that's what this next line is going to do. So now notice what the output is. It's AB. Okay, in terms of columns to print, that's 1. So I'm going to step through this. That's about to be decreased. So how many columns left to print? 0. Remember, this first part of the while statement right here is going to be responsible for the ascending values all the way up to the last letter, which in this case is B. So we have A as the first row. We have AB. We're now ready for the next part of the while loop, which is going to display all the descending letters. So notice what happens here. We go from this while statement to the preparation for this next while statement. So column, which was equal to 2, now I have to decrease that so that it's 1, because remember, the output said AB. Well, all I have is one more letter after that to display, A. So that's why I take this value, column, and I subtract it by 1. So now columns to print for this bottom section is just only 1. And then in terms of the ASCII value, consider this. Now, notice that ASCII value is equal to 67. Let's go over here and notice that 67 is the letter C. See, what's going on is the ASCII to print was incrementing those values, assuming that we were going to go through this while loop again and again and again. Now remember, we displayed the AB, and so it says, okay, now let's go ahead and display the C, but the while loop is false, so we never do that. We never display the C. What this line does is it restores order to the universe, knowing that it's increased by 2, and we don't want to display the letter C, we want to display the letter A. So that's why I decrease it by 2. Now, I can just simply step to the next section over here, and where it says print from user entry to A, well, all we're going to do is just print that one column, which is the letter A. So I go inside the loop, ASCII to print to 65, so that's just the letter A. So output now is going to be concatenated with the letter A. So now notice what happens down here in the output. When I go through the next step, now we have A and then ABA for the next row. All right, so ASCII value to print. Again, we don't know that if we're necessarily going to go through this loop again and again and again. That is determined over here in the criteria, but we need to prepare for the possibility of going through this next loop, so that's why I decrease it by 1. So I'll just simply click over here. In terms of columns to print, we've already printed 1, so 1 minus 1 is going to be 0. So do we have another column to print? No, we don't. 0 is not greater than or equal to 1. So now we jump out of that while loop, and now we're going to get ready for going up to the top of the next while loop to get ready for the next row, because over here we have A, B, A. The next row should just simply be, we entered C, right? I think for the user input. Let me double check. Let's see, user entry. Yeah, user entry is C, so we do have another row where it's going to say A, B, C, B, A. So let's just follow that, see what happens here. Okay, so output is now going to have the new line constant, so we're going to go to the beginning of the next line. So we see that represented with a little space right there. Rows to print. Okay, so we've got 2 rows to print. So let's see what happens here. Now that's going to go to 1. Right, rows to print is equal to 1. In terms of the number of columns, now the columns is equal to 2. We have to add 1 more to it. Then columns to print, that's going to equal to 3. Go back over here to the top of the while loop. Rows to print. Do we have any more rows to print? We sure do. It's 1, so is 1 greater than or equal to 1? Yes. So now we go over here, ASCII value. Let's go to this while loop. Okay, let's get the letter, and now we can stop right here. So whatever the letter is, which in this case is A, that's going to be the first letter to be displayed on the beginning of the next row. That's why you see the A right here now. And then in terms of the ASCII value, that's going to be displaying the letter B. Columns to print, we only have 3 more letters to draw. Actually, when we subtract it by 1, it's going to be only 2 more letters. So that's why that goes back to 2. So I'll tell you what, let me just go ahead and skip through all of this and just stop right here, so I can just click continue. And so now you see that A, B, C is displayed. This part of the while loop is now going to be responsible for drawing the remaining letters, namely B and A. So currently ASCII to print is 68, so let me subtract that by 2, because remember 68 is the letter D, but I don't want to display D now, I want to display B, right? Because I want to display A, B, C, B, not the letter D, so I have to subtract it by 2, because it's currently D. Okay, once I do that, columns to print, that's going to equal to 2, right? I have to display the letter B and A, so 2 more columns. All right, so now that my letter is the letter B, let's concatenate that to the output. So now you see the letter B there. And now in terms of columns to print, we only have 1 more to print. So now my letter is equal to A. Let's send that to the output in terms of concatenating that, and there we go, the letter B. Okay, so now notice the columns to print after this line is going to be equal to 0. So when we go back to the while loop, is 0 greater than or equal to 1? No, it's not. So we're finished here. And now let's go ahead and concatenate a VB new line constant, so it goes to the beginning of the next line. Rows to print is currently equal to 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. Columns to print is going to be incremented. Let's go back to the while loop. Okay, so 0 greater than or equal to 1. That's false. So we go over here to the output, and we just simply take whatever the value of output is, which is A, ABA, ABCBA, and send it to the label text property. So when I click continue, that's why you see the appropriate pyramid based on the user entry. And that's it. Okay, so this is Professor Robert Solis. I hope this video lesson has been helpful. Have a good day. We'll see you next time.